Hi, I am Amy Laurel Fluker, and I'm the Robert W. Reeder I Professor of History at Youngstown State University. And I'm very excited to be able to offer a few suggestions for a different approach to the study of Midwestern history. This is very much sort of the germ of an idea rather than its consummation. But this spring, I taught a really fun and rewarding graduate course called Readings in American History, Memory, Folklore, and the Supernatural. I designed the course to help me establish the theoretical framework for my current book project, which I'm co-authoring with my late advisor, Dr. John Neff. This work examines late 19th century ghost stories as a means of offering new insights into how Americans dealt with or deflected the trauma of the American Civil War. So I've got ghosts on the brain, and I was struck when rereading John Locke's The Lost Region to find the Midwest described therein as, quote, a ghost among regions that has been lost to the popular and historical imagination. It occurred to me that the supernatural, as a means of examining identity, place, and loss, offers an interesting approach to grappling with Midwestern history. Now, this could mean one of a couple things. It might mean, one, pursuing research into the cultural history of the supernatural, as I'm doing with this current project, or two, applying spectral theory to regionalism. Now, in the first case, the Midwest is certainly full of ghost lore. In the course of working on this manuscript, I stumbled upon an incredible account of a haunting that afflicted Cleveland in the winter of 1884. The Washington, D.C. Evening Star reported that Cleveland is enjoying a reign of ghosts, and one Cleveland newspaper estimated that 4,000 or 5,000 locals had flocked to visit this haunted house in the suburbs. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should be investigating the reality of episodes like this. I think whether we decide, as scholars to take ghosts seriously or not, their social and cultural importance shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. But we might consider ghosts in their most broad sense as a kind of conceptual metaphor. In this guise, they provide a discursive framework for considering the spectralization or erasure of the Midwest and its history. The so-called spectral turn of scholarship gathered momentum after the publication of Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx in 1993. Responding to a claim that the fall of the Soviet Union brought an end to Marxism and perhaps to history itself, Derrida asks, whither Marxism? In other words, what's going to become of this field post 1991, post the fall of the Soviet Union? And I think a similar question brings us here today. Whither the Midwest? Noting that Marx began his manifesto with the declaration that, quote, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, Derrida uses ghosts as a metaphor to deconstruct history and temporality. Specters, Derrida says, defy all our accepted logic about beginnings, endings, and continuation. And as we confront the past, present, and future of our own field, Derrida's theory may prove useful. Since he invoked the specters of Marx, ghosts have provided a discourse, a means of understanding the intangible forces that give order and meaning to our world. In this sense, I would suggest that regionalism is a spectral force. It's no less real for being unseen, no less powerful for being intangible. Historians readily accept the influence of other spectral forces over our lives. According to Renee Berglund, nationalism, race, class, and gender can all be understood as ghostly entities. She writes, all of us must believe in ghosts just as we believe in stories, in histories, or in memories. As Judith Richardson puts it, hauntings reveal how senses of the past and of place are apprehended and created, what they suggest about marginal and invisible things that texture and define identity, politics, and social life. So granted that regionalism is a powerful, if spectral force, how does this translate to the topic at hand? What does it mean to consider the Midwest a ghost among regions? One of the reasons I've come to think that spectrality offers a compelling framework for regional studies is that this kind of work often takes on a mournful tone. Regionalism often stems from the sense that history can provide a means of preserving unique regional characteristics that are increasingly being lost to time. This is certainly true in the context of Midwestern studies. This is, after all, the lost region. And this sense of loss certainly permeates my particular corner of the Midwest. In Youngstown, Ohio, deindustrialization, depopulation, and urban decay have transformed a once very vibrant city into kind of a ghost town. Many locals are preoccupied by what Youngstown has lost. But what's really interesting to me is that this sense of loss is transgenerational. My students, who are now the better part of 2 generations removed from Black Monday and the closure of the steel mills, seem to share their grandparents' conviction that the city is just a shadow of its former glory. They're literally haunted. I recently came across an article by historian Stephen Kahn in Rust Belt magazine that speaks to this mentality. In this article, Kahn makes the argument that the Midwestern voters who supported Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election were not motivated by economic anxiety, as we so often heard, but rather by their sense of place. Kahn writes, many Trump voters live in a landscape of loss, of people, of schools and other institutions, of local businesses and more, and that loss surrounds them every day. Life in those places, Kahn says, really was once better than it is today. Kahn's landscape of loss stuck with me. It evokes 2 key components of spectral theory: the sensation of the uncanny and the experience of trauma. For those with living or generational memories of Youngstown's heyday, its current state of declension evokes the sensation Sigmund Freud termed the uncanny. And Freud's 1915 essay, The Uncanny, is a cornerstone of spectral theory. So, according to Freud, the uncanny is that feeling you get when you experience a disjuncture between a thing as you imagine it and a thing as it is. And most interestingly, for our purposes, Freud notes that the uncanny is inherently related to a sense of place. He explains that the German for uncanny literally means unhomely. So, in other words, an experience is uncanny when you find yourself disoriented in a setting that should otherwise be familiar and comfortable. By this measure, the abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and grass-grown streets of Youngstown are certainly uncanny for those who remember them as vibrant and bustling, or have been raised to remember them that way. This uncanny landscape is suffused with loss. As Kahn points out, Midwesterners live with daily reminders of that loss and carry intergenerational trauma associated with it. And trauma, as spectral theorists have observed, is a kind of haunting. So here again is a useful application, I think, of spectral theory for scholars of the Midwest. It offers a framework for interpreting catastrophic collective experiences like deindustrialization. I want to suggest that a spectral history of the Midwest can allow us to engage with its past, present, and future all at once. As Derrida says, ghosts defy conventional temporality. They literally represent the intrusion of the past into the present, but they also always return. Therefore, as theorists Maria del Pilar Blanco and Esther Pirin observe, studies of ghosts and hauntings can do more than obsessively recall a fixed past. In active engagement, they may reveal the insufficiency of the present moment, as well as the dense consolations and erasures of the past, and offer a tentative hopefulness for future resolutions. So, what would a spectral history of the Midwest look like? I think it would look very much like Judith Richardson's masterful study of the Hudson River Valley possessions. It might also look like the excellent volume Phantom Past, Indigenous Presence, which roots indigenous spirituality and narratives of hauntings to the importance of place. A spectral history of the Midwest would be highly interdisciplinary, drawing from cultural history, literary analysis, folklore, and anthropology. The work of Megan Hillier Geisler, who presented at this conference on Midwestern asylums, her work exemplifies such an approach. Megan's work also impressed me with its implications for public policy and philanthropy in this region. I'm convinced that Midwestern history can't only be backward looking. Midwesterners, my colleagues, students, and neighbors at least, they're very conscious of the past. They live in that landscape of loss, as Kahn described it. And what they seem to struggle with, and where I think scholars can offer a valuable and instructive perspective, is reckoning with that past. Now, I'm a historian of memory, so I think it's important to say that it's not a historian's job to make the past palatable or to perpetuate unifying narratives to bolster collective or local identities. But by taking a spectral turn, we may help Midwesterners, in the words of Derrida, learn to live otherwise and better by learning to live with ghosts. As Pilar Blanco and Piran note, a history conceived as spectral would necessitate a reflection of how the past is both absent and present within the now moment, and also how the past can open up possibilities for the future. Kahn's landscape of loss is only one incarnation of the Midwest. It has taken another form, and it could still take another. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So following up on the excellent roundtable on Black Midwestern History Matters and some of the other great panels at the conference, I'd like to spend my time by exploring the paradox of Northern racism and hopefully put this paper in conversation with some of the ones that have already been given at the conference and some of the great questions that have been asked and answered. One aspect of this paradox is the false assumption that the lack of slavery equates a lack of racism, and that therefore being against slavery equates higher rates of racial egalitarianism. Jennifer Harber's recent book, Organizing Freedom, on the other hand, shows how slavery and freedom in antebellum Illinois and Indiana were a matter of gradation rather than dichotomy. And this follows similar arguments in older 19th century scholarship by Nikki Taylor, Leslie Schwam, Leon Litwack, Jacques Vogeli, and others, works both new and relatively older. All these works help to illustrate the fact that before the Civil War, every Midwestern state and territory, whether they had been part of the Northwest Territory or the Louisiana Purchase, had laws that banned African Americans from voting, from attending public school, from serving in the state legislature, from serving in the state militia, or from settling in that state or territory at all unless they were able to post a substantial bond as, quote, proof of good behavior. Moving to the 20th century, we see this paradox including the false assumption that a lack of explicitly racist laws equates a lack of racism, and that being against explicitly racist laws equates higher rates of racial egalitarianism. So before the Civil War, the idea is if slavery is illegal, then that means that there's more freedom. And after the Civil War, it means that if there's no explicitly racist laws, then that means there's more freedom. So this means, for instance, that the Midwest is seen as better than the South because Black people could vote in the Midwest and did not have to sit in the back of the bus. Here, too, there's much scholarship showing the impact of de facto racist laws, of racist policies by private institutions and individuals that were allowed to stand because the law did not ban those policies, of ineffectual laws that were meant to ban racism but were either toothless or unenforced, and of the threat and reality of violence. Just to cite one example of the scholarship, I'll briefly mention Ashley Howard's recent work on Omaha during the 1960s as one example. I also give several historical examples. In 1883, the US Supreme Court struck down the 1875 Civil Rights Act. And in response, the state of Iowa passed the 1884 Iowa Civil Rights Act, which banned racial discrimination in most places of business. That very same year, Joseph Bolin, who was a barber in Cedar Rapids and a co-organizer of one of the Iowa Black State Conventions that has been mentioned by several other scholars at the conference, was turned away from a skating rink. The state Supreme Court ruled against him on a technicality, thus ending a 20-year era of racially liberal decisions by Iowa courts. Other lawsuits in Iowa were similarly unsuccessful until 1949, when Edna Griffin, who was a Des Moines educator, a former member of the Women's Army Corps, and a progressive activist, sued a local drugstore and ultimately succeeded in getting the Iowa Supreme Court to rule that businesses could not deny service based on race. And yet, neither this decision nor similar decisions in other courts in other Midwestern states ended discrimination by business owners and employees who, unlike the drugstore owner in Des Moines, unlike the skating rink owner in Cedar Rapids 140 years ago, had the sense to not openly say that they were racially discriminating and thus did not give an obvious target in a court of law. So here, what comes to mind is something in the present day. One of my local businesses, McNally's, which is a bar on the south side of Chicago in a previously all-white neighborhood owned by a white Chicago police officer. In 2014, McNally's made the national news because a blues band was playing there, and the owner shut down the performance because, to quote him, there were too many Black people in the bar. McNally's also uses its marquee to make questionable statements. Most recently, one which, on one side of the marquee, praised Catholic schools, and on the other side of the marquee, attacked Chicago public schools. Anyone who knows Chicago knows that referring to Catholic schools versus public schools is very much coded racial language, even though there are plenty of Black people and other minorities who go to Catholic schools, myself included. Few Black people who live in this increasingly diverse neighborhood are interested in eating or drinking at McNally's. There's no law saying you can't, but there is the unspoken message that certain people are not welcome here, welcome there. On a more personal level, I'm currently in the process of closing on a home in the Chicago suburb of Berwyn, which was once more than one of the 450 sundown towns in Illinois, and is next to another suburb called Cicero, which once had race riots to prevent African Americans and Latinx people from moving in or attending a local Christian school, and where my uncle was stabbed back in the 1970s, and where last year, after George Floyd's murder, residents stood outside homes and businesses with weapons and attacked Black motorists who were driving through. Now, one could argue that this misconception about the Midwest, that there was no, explicit legalized slavery, that the explicitly racial laws were abolished earlier, and therefore that means that there's less racism or that this is an equal place, an egalitarian place. One could argue that that misconception is yet another example of the general public thinking one thing, while we enlightened and educated scholars, of course, know more, know better, read better, publish better, and give conference papers better. Even if that's true, if it's true that scholars know that the Midwest is not necessarily equal simply because of a difference in legal policy, whereas the general public doesn't know that, in a world where misinformation is readily available on any device, and there's little to referee between, on the one hand, honest, accurate, and questioning scholarship, and on the other hand, the now infamous phrase, quote, I did my own research, the future of Midwestern history must also involve greater efforts to engage the general public because of this misconception. And so I would argue that part of the future of Midwestern scholarship is that there absolutely has to be more emphasis there. We have to continue to encourage the many digital history projects that are underway or ongoing. Whether those sites are focused on primary sources, whether those sites are focused on providing scholarship that is accessible to the general public, whether it's a combination of both those things, but essentially the effort to struggle against misinformation or no information at all must include this public history, and that's going to increasingly take place in a digital form. One could also argue that even if it is true that the lines are blurred between Southern slavery on the one hand, or Southern slavery and de facto racism on the one hand, versus the Midwest lack of slavery and less de facto racism on the other hand, the fact remains that for the last 200 years, thousands and thousands of African Americans have left the South for the Midwest. So one could argue, if there's no difference between these two regions, North and South, when it comes to race relations, why have so many African Americans left the South for the Midwest since the early 1800s? Here, one could respond by looking at the growing scholarship on the reverse migration from the Midwest and other northern places to the South. Not to the small towns and rural areas that many Southern migrants originally left from, but to rapidly growing cities like Houston and Phoenix and Nashville and Atlanta. Although we will also have to see if the renewed efforts at voting suppression and anti LGBTQ laws and laws that are trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory and other right wing measures passed by the Republican legislatures, who still control states like Texas and Tennessee and Georgia and Arizona, if those efforts will slow or even stop this reverse migration. Or, on the other hand, as we have seen in at least part of the Midwest, this migration will continue and will eventually turn at least some of those states blue. That remains to be seen because this is a process that's ongoing right now. But that too will be part of the history of Black Midwestern, or part of the history of Midwestern scholarship is looking at people who are leaving from the Midwest and the impact that they have. But I would also cite in response to the idea of if the South and Midwest are not so different, then why did people leave the South for the Midwest? Here I'll cite the long legacy of African Americans who came from the South to the Midwest and were met with deadly violence either to themselves or to loved ones. Just to give a few examples, Nathaniel Morgan in Dubuque, Iowa in 1841, Cincinnati's entire antebellum Black community on several occasions during the 1830s and 1840s. Margaret Garner's children near Cincinnati. And to be clear here, I'm placing responsibility for that incident not on Margaret Garner herself, but on the slave catchers who pursued her and her family, and the multi general legacy of white sexual assault against her and her mother and her grandmother that therefore put her in the impossible position of either ending her daughter's life or subjecting her daughter to the same fate. Moving on from there, Eugene Williams on Chicago Beach in 1919, not to mention countless others in other Midwestern cities like Springfield, East St. Louis, Duluth, Omaha, and other places in the 1910s and early 1920s. Earl Little in Omaha and Milwaukee and Lansing, Michigan in the 1920s, ending in Lansing, Michigan, where his life finally was taken from him. Fred Hampton in Chicago in 1969. George Floyd in Minneapolis almost exactly 1 year ago, along with other police shootings in Minneapolis and other Midwestern cities over the last few years. And so, future scholarship on the Midwest to focus on Floyd will have to note that the greatest social protests in America since the 1960s were catalyzed by a murder that took place in the upper Midwest, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But this in turn requires that the Midwesternness of that murder not be ignored or erased in the same way that Malcolm X's Midwestern identity often has. People, George Floyd has often been described as a Southerner. He was also a Midwesterner, in the same way that Malcolm X has often been described as someone from the East Coast, born and raised in the Midwest. And so, without understanding that Midwestern piece of that, then neither of those events and nor will this broader history be understood. To kind of take a sort of a humorous perspective on this, on the idea of sort of erasing this Black Midwestern identity. 25 years ago, the comedian Chris Rock sought to refute the notion that Blacks are responsible for most crime in America by saying, for instance, that Black people cannot possibly be responsible for most of the crime in Minnesota because, quote, the only Black people in Minnesota are Prince and Kirby Puckett. Now, this is a joke. It resonated with people because when you think Minnesota, you think white, but of course, that is a misconception. What happened on the corner of 30th and Chicago in Minneapolis last May, and what happened to Philando Castile before that, and what happened to Dante Wright after that, shows that, yes, in fact, Chris Rock, there are Black people in Minnesota, and that their lives are affected and sometimes cut short by the perception that they're responsible for crime, even as they're simultaneously ignored as even being part of Midwestern identity and history at all. And then finally, one could argue that this sad tradition began with the person who you might consider to be the founder of the Black Midwest, Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable, who came not from the South, but from the Caribbean. So in that regard, different, but on the other hand, very similar to people like Louise Little, Malcolm X's mother, or Minnie Minoso, or other Black Midwesterners who came to the Midwest from the Caribbean, and who faced not direct violence or discrimination like some of the other folks I've mentioned, but rather the indirect violence of nearly being erased from history. And so essentially, the effort to give a white man, John Kinsey, credit for founding Chicago might have actually succeeded if not for the efforts over many decades of scholars and community activists who kept DuSable's memory alive in scholarship, in the naming and renaming of space, and generally in Black Midwestern collective memory. So this too is the past and present of Black Midwestern history, and it must also be the future. Thank you.
Two really terrific talks by Amy and David. And what I'm going to talk about is going to begin at kind of a dry level, and we'll kind of circle around back to the sort of things that they're talking about. So I just want to appreciate what they said and thank John for putting this together, and I could go on. But anyway, here we go. So I'd like to talk about my new but far from finished project that traces the roots of the idea of regionalism in America to the emerging Middle West of the 1890s. Building upon my recent work on the birth of the idea of cultural pluralism in the Midwest during the years surrounding the First World War, my new project digs deeper into the 1880s and 90s to uncover the sources of yet another crucial set of ideas. Our first self-conscious theories of region and regionalism growing out of the Middle West during its earliest years as a recognized region. Emerging from the dynamic, youthful, and increasingly diverse region that was a cauldron of conflict and creativity in the 1890s and early 1900s, this idea emerged out of that milieu. And just as I found a pluralistic zeitgeist encouraging the full flowering of ethnic and certain racial groups in the Midwest, and I don't mean to euphemize this, I'll come back to it later. In the youthful Midwest between the years 1910 and 1920, I'm now tracing a regionalist climate of opinion emerging there 20 years earlier. In the largest sense, I'm looking at the early Midwest as the birthplace and continuing fertile ground for the expansion of these ideas to embrace an ever-widening cross-section of humanity. I begin with the first generation of American regionalists, focusing on four foundational thinkers, writers, and activists. They may be pretty obvious, but John Wesley Powell, Jane Addams, Frederick Jackson Turner, and Hamlin Garland, with brief reference to the gadfly Frank Lloyd Wright along the way. All were native Midwesterners, and all but Powell were born in the 1860s. There were other early regionalists: William Dean Howells, Mary Austin, Zona Gale, Vachel Lindsay, and I'll talk about two foundational Black early regionalists in a moment. But my first few chapters begin with these four people. John Wesley Powell, the intrepid one-armed explorer of the Grand Canyon, was deeply shaped by his childhood and youth in Ohio, Wisconsin, and Illinois in the 1840s and 50s. And in the last decade of his life, he returned in his imagination to his native region, writing what Donald Worster has described as, quote, an old man's Valentine to the richness, beauty, and history of the lands he had spent a lifetime exploring, learning to see and love. And he wrote a monograph in the last 10 years of his life, or even right close to the end of his life, that is largely focused on the Midwest, and that introduced the idea of the physiographic region to a wider public. It's very significant. Addams, who in many ways is my favorite and most admirable early figure, pioneered a profound theory of urban regionalism, a far-sighted vision of what she called the cosmopolitan neighborhood. I just have to move on, based upon her lived experience in the densely packed, multi-ethnic 19th Ward in Chicago, beginning with the founding of Hull House in 1889. This is her theory has deeply significant and ongoing implications into the 21st century. Turner, and we've all heard about Turner, who was deeply influenced by Powell's physiographic regionalism, also had a deep interest in cultural regionalism as a necessary sequel to the dying frontier. It is often forgotten that Turner was a much, if not more, ardent advocate of regionalism than he was a proponent of the frontier. As early as 1890, 3 years before his dramatic frontier speech at the Columbian Exposition, Turner published an essay that first speculating about the reciprocal relationship between frontier and region. These were two ideas that came forth at the same time, as early as 1890. The region was in many ways an even larger, more significant concept than the frontier. And Turner wrote about this for the first time the same summer of 1890 that Adams published her earliest vision of regionalism, of urban regionalism. Garland from Wisconsin, like Turner, was also one of the first Americans to develop a theory of regionalism. It's embedded in his harsh, naturalistic stories of the Middle Border, main traveled roads, published in 1891, further developed in a fiery talk he gave at the Columbian Exposition 2 years later, and fully expressed in his polemical tract, Crumbling Idols, published in 1894. Garland is a tricky, slippery character, interested in ghosts, by the way, Amy, who wandered far afield from his vision of radical protest and regionalism by the turn of the century. Along with Wright and perhaps William Dean Howells, Powell, Adams, Turner, and Garland were foundation builders. And yet the story does not end there. They laid the foundation, but by the late 1940s, a richer, more diverse and inclusive vision of region and regionalism emerged from the Midwest. And much of this from the highly significant Black Midwest. Early figures in this movement include Christian socialist minister Reverend E. Cassius Ransom and his radical social work in Chicago, and the writings at the turn of the 19th century, and Ida B. Wells and her powerful legacy as an activist and writer in Chicago after her move there in 1893. They were highly significant figures from the turn of the century, followed by Missouri-born Langston Hughes and Mississippi-born Richard Wright, who both lived in and wrote extensively about the Midwest in the late 1920s, 30s, and 40s. All of these people, as has been pointed out in the earlier talks and very effectively by Eric McDuffie, expressed a dialectic of opportunity and oppression in their newfound region. Other significant Midwestern writers who expanded our vision of regionalism during these years include St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton and their magisterial work, Black Metropolis, 1945, Jack Conroy and Arna Bontemps and their book, They Seek a City, the same year, 1945, and Meridel LeSueur and her Proletarian Regional History, North Star Country, also published in 1945. In addition to these Midwestern-based writers, I'm also thinking of bootlegging in two Oklahoma-born writers and intellectuals, kind of on the periphery of the Midwest, I know, who've contributed to and greatly diversified American regional thought, Ralph Ellison and John Hope Franklin. All of these Midwesterners, or loosely based writers and thinkers from the Midwest, have been essential contributors to American regionalism and regional thought from the 1890s to the 1950s. There's much more to this story, but I'll stop here, and I look forward to interacting with the panelists and answering any questions from the audience. Thank you. Thank you.
My objective today is to explore the decline in the study of Midwestern political history in the 1930s, its resurrection in the 1970s and 80s, and where we are today in light of the last two presidential elections. The decline of the field of Midwestern history in the 1930s and 40s was symptomatic of a broader intellectual assault on Midwest political culture occurring within the same period. Prior to the Great Depression, Midwestern academics, inspired by what moderator John Lauck describes as Frederick Jackson Turner's break with Eastern historians who ignored happenings beyond the Hudson River, had committed themselves to investigating the political Midwest and its impact on American democracy. Historians at Midwestern universities oriented their departments towards state and regional studies. They founded state historical societies, established the Mississippi Valley History Association, and preserved the region's history in books and articles. In their works, they reinforced Turner's assertion that despite the passing of the material forces that gave vitality to Western democracy, the spirit of the Western influence upon democracy endured. Having inherited from their pioneering ancestors particular ways of looking at things, Midwestern historians prided themselves as intellectual pioneers with a fresh and compelling paradigm for interpreting American history. Their paradigm came under attack during the 1930s. The Great Depression and the New Dealers' approach to tackling the economic crisis quieted the Turnerian revolt against the East. On Ivy League campuses, academics called into question the purported determining values of American democracy that Turner's disciples ascribed to the frontier experience. What one historian has referred to as the Eastern bastions of power and intellectuality rejected Middle American notions about competitive individualism, self-reliance, and a free, self-directed people, none of which, they contended, could remedy the economic condition. By World War II, it had become fashionable to associate the allegedly unenlightened features of American life, crass commercialism, Philistinism, provincialism, isolationism, with the political culture of the Midwest. Negative stereotypes shaped Eastern journalists' commentaries about Midwestern lawmakers. In response, Midwestern congressmen began verbalizing their suspicions about the urban bias of New Deal officials. In the realm of foreign affairs, for instance, Midwesterners conceded that they were generally united in their opposition to Lend-Lease aid, though their stance was due in large part to concerns about war profiteering by the Eastern businessmen who dominated the nation's industrial plants. Nevertheless, in the weeks leading up to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Midwestern congressmen faced charges that they were hysterical, cowardly, soft, and selfish. The pre-war East-West divide persisted after World War II, when representatives of Wall Street and State Street, supported by the nation's principal media organs, ridiculed inland Republicans for their preoccupation with domestic subversion. Carl Munt of South Dakota, Jim Kem of Missouri, Burke Hickenlooper of Iowa, Hugh Butler and Kenneth Wary of Nebraska, Bill Jenner of Indiana, John Bricker of Ohio, etc., were labeled reactionaries and extremists. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, a paragon of the Eastern establishment, condensed his feelings toward Midwest lawmakers into a single unflattering term. They were the primitives. The struggle between Main Street and Wall Street fashioned the political landscape of the late 1940s and 1950s. Red Scare episodes like the Hiss case and Army McCarthy hearings exemplified the culture war between Eastern internationalists and Midwest conservatives whose constituents' religious and rural prejudices conditioned their attitude toward communism. The decline and fall of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy portended a Republican realignment. For the next 20 years, the GOP's East Coast wing, the Lodge, Scranton, Rockefeller bloc, if you will, policed the Republican Party. But events in the 1970s upended American politics, and in the process restored the prominence of Midwestern politics and politicians. In the 1970s, Midwest conservatives of various stripes voiced their opposition to affirmative action, gun control, the Equal Rights Amendment, and decisions by the Warren and Burger courts, Roe v. Wade chief among them. Midwest conservatives clamored for tax cuts, deregulation, a buildup of the military, and a war on crime. The Midwest found itself at the center of presidential politics. At the 1976 GOP convention in Kansas City, Michigan's Gerald Ford and his vice presidential running mate, Bob Dole of Kansas, faced a challenge from a native Illinoisan, Ronald Reagan, who 4 years later secured the Republican nomination in Detroit. Midwest Rust Belt voters, the celebrated Reagan Democrats, joined a coalition of Midwestern economic libertarians and conservative Christians, the new right of the Republican Party, to propel Reagan into the White House. From that time to ours, the Midwest has become America's most hotly contested battleground, and hence our understanding of the political history of the Midwest is essential to our analyses of national elections. American democracy, it appears, is shaped by Midwest voters' particular way of looking at things. Presidential elections are won and lost in Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, where voters swing back and forth between Democrat and Republican candidates to determine the next occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The nation's contentious rural-urban divide is at its most glaring in Midwest purple states. What were once critical Bush-Obama counties in Michigan and Wisconsin might now be better classified as Trump-Biden counties. The Midwest was ground zero for the Tea Party rebellion, which witnessed Scott Walker of Wisconsin, John Kasich of Ohio, Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota, Joni Ernst of Iowa, and Kristi Noem of South Dakota, energize a constituency frustrated and demoralized by the policies and the rhetoric of President Barack Obama. GOP governors in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin led movements to restrict the bargaining power of public employees. In the 2016 election, a brash, combative New York casino mogul with a reputation as a womanizer won the support of voters in the Great Plains Bible Belt and the Great Lakes Rust Belt. In early 2020, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota and Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, warned their Democratic Party primary rivals that the Midwest is the undisputed bellwether of electoral politics, that the values, sensibilities, and interests of Midwesterners should be the target of Democratic messaging. Democrats, noted a CNBC analyst, saw reclaiming the Midwest as their clearest path to denying Donald Trump a second term. Deny Trump they did. The college-educated voters from Midwestern counties with growing populations who voted for Trump in 2016 rejected him in 2020. President Joe Biden won Michigan and Wisconsin by outperforming Hillary Clinton in places like Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Lansing, and Oakland County, Michigan, and in Milwaukee County and Dane County in Wisconsin, and steadily growing counties in Ohio like Delaware County. Significantly, Biden's gains in the suburban Midwest exceeded Trump's smaller gains in Midwestern suburbs. Beyond the outcome of the presidential race, however, voting behaviors in Michigan and Wisconsin were illustrative of a larger Midwestern pattern that merits the attention of Midwestern historians. In 2016, Trump carried 12 Michigan counties that twice voted for Obama. Trump won 11 of those 12 counties in 2020, leading some analysts to suggest that former Bush-Obama counties are now comfortably within the GOP column. No blue wave was evident on election night, and if anything, the GOP's, or at least Trump's grip on the rural Midwest has tightened. Rural Midwestern voters without college degrees have been Trumpified and now comprise the bulk of the Trump wing of the Republican Party. Trump won 73 of 83 counties in Michigan, and in 63 of those counties, his 2020 tallies exceeded those of 2016. Biden won only 14 of 72 counties in Wisconsin, and in Michigan, Trump's policies, if not his personality, clearly helped down-ballot Republican candidates more than Biden helped Democratic candidates for state offices. The election, observed a Republican strategist, showed us that GOP policies and ideas worked up and down the ticket, but it was Trump's personality that cost us the White House. In light of the disturbing events at the US Capitol on January 6th, it's uncomfortable discussing the influence of Donald Trump on Midwestern politics. And yet one should keep in mind that had Trump not erupted onto the political landscape in the summer of 2015, the political forces that materialized in the Midwest in the 1970s would still have affected the elections of 2016 and 2020. As Secretary Clinton observed in her memoir of the 2016 presidential campaign, the different strands of anxiety and resentment evident among Trump supporters were consistent with the anxiety and resentment strands evident in the industrial Midwest in the 1980s and the 1990s. The future of manufacturing jobs, concerns about immigration, so-called redistributive policies that appear to favor minorities, regulations that wear on small businesses, and an uneasiness with urban cosmopolitanism, issues that galvanized Trump voters, were evident among Midwest supporters of Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. When linked with a political messaging tailored to rural Midwesterners who championed traditional marriage and gender roles, gun rights, individual responsibility, patriotic education, and pro-life activism, the GOP platform appeals to a broad base of rural and urban voters that inhabit the Rust Belt, the Corn Belt, and the Wheat Belt. The political cocktail of social and cultural conservatism, Tea Partyism, and America Firstism makes electoral contests in the Midwest competitive, if not decisive, affairs. The study of the Midwest variant of these isms is seminal to our understanding of our national political culture. Arguably, it appears that in the nearly 130 years since Frederick Jackson Turner sought to characterize the effects of the Westward March on American democracy, there remains what Turner identified as the spirit of the Western influence upon democracy, that the ancestors of pioneering Midwesterners retain, for better or worse, a particular way of looking at things that distinguishes them from their fellow citizens. While the issues of Turner's day are not ours, Midwesterners' particular way of looking at things is once again captivating the public consciousness. The importance of the Midwest to presidential politics ensures a bright future for the study of Midwestern political history. Young Midwestern historians should be encouraged to explore the political history of their states and localities. For doing so will introduce them to larger questions about political socialization, party realignments, redistricting, interest groups, campaigns and elections, the new media, and the politics of the pulpit. The time is ripe for undergraduate and graduate students at Midwestern colleges and universities to explore the historical forces that shape their region's political identity. Midwestern political history has a bright future. It should be one of our tasks to introduce students to the meaningful political history that awaits them in their own backyard. Thank you.
John, thank you for inviting me to take part, and thank the other members of this panel. My paper here is called History Happens Here, Past and Future of Midwestern History. March 2021 was Iowa History Month, an annual event that celebrates the rich and diverse story of a place, quote, unlike anywhere else, unquote, as the state's governor, Kim Reynolds, noted without any irony in a YouTube video. If you wore a shirt that said Iowa, history happens here. It's for sale on the Raygun t-shirt site here in Des Moines. The company also has a shirt with a map of the Midwest made by people not from the Midwest that labels Ohio as Idaho and labels Iowa as Ohio. The governor's shirt is optimistic, and it emphasizes the idea that the world sees Iowa and the region as a backwater, void of all that much importance. History happens to the Midwest: floods, droughts, tornadoes, farm crises, but history's not really made here all that much. The Midwest is the Rodney Dangerfield of America. It can't get any respect. It has a nearly $4 trillion economy, ranking alongside Germany as the world's fourth largest. But as John Locke has noted, it's a lost region. It's a hard to define place, and it doesn't get enough historical attention. Andrew Caton noted that no one wrote about the Midwest as an historical entity. Stories were written about life in the Midwest, but not about the Midwest. The region's attracted attention from historians for decades, who have been especially drawn to histories of agriculture and the environment. Farming made the Midwest, and it defines the region. even if less than 5% of Iowans are classified as farm producers. Books like William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, Walter Prescott Webb's The Great Plains, Donald Worster's Dust Bowl, and Glinda Riley's The Female Frontier have been important for helping us understand the region. So the field of Midwestern history, it's not young, but it's also not terribly mature. It's an area that is ambiguous and indistinct, and our interpretive foundations are still incomplete. We're about where the American West was in the 1980s, as new Western historians like Patricia Limerick and Richard White busted myths and challenged outdated ideas. We're still working on figuring out what the foundational ideas are and why the region is worth study, why the Midwest is really important. There's huge gaps in our story. The last histories of Iowa agriculture were written in the 1950s and 1960s. City of Des Moines has never had a good history. We need new histories of the Sauk and the Meskwaki and the Iowa. The last history of North Dakota was written in 1966. We have huge gaps in our knowledge and our history of the region. Non-white peoples have been often neglected and ignored. And we need new histories of the region and histories of our states. The Midwest could use a multi-volume history along the lines of what the University of Nebraska Press is doing on the American West. You might know Colin Calloway's One Vast Winter Count, or you might know Anne Hyde's Empires, Nations, and Families. There's a 11-volume series on the American South. Most famously, C. Van Woodward's Origins of the New South is part of that series. So we could use a multi-volume history series for our state, one that is fully updated for the 2020s and the 21st century, one that incorporates the histories of those that have been left out of previous stories in the Midwest. We could also use some new state histories. We have recent good histories of places like Indiana, Michigan, and Nebraska, but histories of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Illinois need to be updated. The most recent volume in South Dakota, a new South Dakota history edited by Herbert Hoover, is a huge volume with about a dozen different authors. No general audience is probably going to be terribly interested in that. We also need new histories of familiar events. Nicole Etchison did a great book on Bleeding Kansas. My colleague Pamela Riney-Kerberg is writing a new history of the farm crisis in Iowa. We should also think about our historiography. What books and articles are the foundation of how we think? What historians have made a difference for us? What sources have been our guides to the region? A book of historiographical essays on the Midwest, like one that was done on American history about 10 years ago by Eric Foner and Lisa McGurr, would be useful. A series of essays published in the Middle West Review would also accomplish that task. There are many topics that can be pursued. The Midwest is a region deeply transformed by globalization and capitalism. I mean, if you think about it, Midwestern history is the history of American capitalism, from railroads all the way to the Rust Belt. Iowa is a state tremendously transformed since American settlement. Iowa has hardly any native prairie left. It's got a lot more hogs than people. And we have terribly polluted waterways. Half of our topsoil is in the Gulf of Mexico or the Mississippi River. So if you're thinking about the changes that have occurred since American settlement, my home state is one that has experienced it as much as anywhere else. But Iowa is a place often ignored by historians. Midwest has been a borderland for many decades. Books by Stephen Aaron on the Midwest and Mark Wyman on Wisconsin detail the many peoples and the various histories of those places. Richard White's Middle Ground has been mentioned at this conference so far. And though it's not been as racially diverse as the South or the West, the stories of non-white Midwesters need to continue to be written. Someone has already mentioned today Leslie Schwalm's Emancipation's Diaspora, which was an important addition to Reconstruction historiography set in a totally unexpected place, the upper Mississippi River Basin. Deborah Fink has written important books on women in Iowa and Nebraska. And Glenda Riley also has written Frontierswoman, the Iowa Experience, Key to Understanding 19th Century Iowa. So we've done much, led by John Locke and all the rest of you, from starting a journal to establishing prizes for outstanding work in the field. There's a huge amount of work left to be done. And if we want to get our message out to a popular audience, as David noted, we do need digital histories, but we also need to rewrite the histories that exist now. We need to write histories of the states or the region in the kind of detail, the kind of nuance, and with the diverse stories that allow us to catch up with maybe the West or the South or New England. So on that note, thank you, John, for inviting me, and thank you for listening to me for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I would like to start the discussion where we began the symposium with Amy's idea of a metaphor of a landscape of loss or a region of ghosts. And she talks about Youngstown and what happened to Youngstown in the steel industry, which we all know. But Jeff was just in Iowa and he mentioned Pam's new book on the 1980s farm crisis. And if you drive through rural America, you see a lot of abandoned farmsteads and a lot of abandoned machinery, and you can see the ghosts of a earlier Midwest that was much different, had a lot more farmers, a lot more smaller farmers, and a place, as Amy says, that has had a lot more steel mills and a lot more heavy industry. So let's just go down the line. Let's start with Mike, because he's kind of the expert on regionalism here. What about this notion of a landscape of loss as a way of telling a regional story?
Mike, it looks like we have you on mute.
Sorry. Often regionalism is connected with kind of backward yearning, nostalgic impulses. And much of what I've been trying to do over the last, I don't know, decade, many decades, is to argue that it's not that, John. So I'd like to see it as kind of a dynamic, forward-looking thing. You're right, the Midwest is a haunted place, and as are all regions. I'm reminded of Patty Limerick writing about the ghost towns that and abandoned mines that litter the West, and the what do you call it? The memorabilia of cow skulls, and you know, this kind of sense of loss and emptiness that is kind of a common image there. So we're not alone in having this. And I don't know, I'm trying to think of the writers I'm writing about: Adams, Turner, Garland, and John Wesley Powell, that they're the major foundational figures. And I guess I could see some nostalgia in Frederick Jackson Turner, and in the later Garland. But most of these people were really pretty much concerned with the present. And so, I don't know. Thank you, John, for throwing it at me. I'm not sure I've given you a very adequate answer, but I guess I'm arguing that this is something that we see in every region. The New England, particularly, the South, even more than the Midwest, and at least the interior West, as I've described it, via Patricia Limerick. So anyway,
Does anybody else want to tackle that before we throw it back to Amy?
I'll just,
I'm sorry, Sean, go ahead.
okay, thanks. Yeah, I was just going to make a brief comment about the anger and bitterness that's becoming more prevalent in rural parts of my home state, and I'm sure in rural parts of Iowa and elsewhere. And it's being expressed in organizations like Second Amendment sanctuary groups, or organizations that are pushing for patriotic education, or they're demanding more of a respect for religion and life and respect for religiosity in rural areas. And how much this has to do with this bitterness and this feeling that the rest of the world is passing the Midwest by, and the Midwest's voice is muted. It's not relevant anymore. People feel like they're not being heard. And it's a kind of an anger and bitterness that I've never experienced before. And I've grown up in this region, born and raised in the region, and was here watching the decline of the agricultural economy. But there's an edge to the anger and the bitterness in rural America now that has caught me off guard. And a lot of it is this passing, this ghost town phenomenon that's beginning to occur. And its expression in organizations like Second Amendment sanctuaries is intriguing. I don't know where it's all going to go, but it's intriguing.
David?
Sure, yeah. This in some ways follows up on that. I don't want to make my brief thoughts after Amy, because whatever she's going to say is going to be better than what's about to come out of my mouth, and I'll just like bring it down. But thinking about, and we've all heard about the places that, that went for Obama once, even twice, and then went for Trump once or twice. And, looking at the big contrast, voting for the first Black president, then voting for almost the exact opposite of that in a lot of ways. And thinking and putting that conversation sort of up against what people say, for instance, about Georgia, about Arizona going blue, about some of the other places that have had a transition. And what you see when those other places come up is that the discussion of why they change colors is connected to demographic change, right? So, the story of Georgia is the story of the reverse migration. So many, Atlanta becoming bigger and more diverse, so many Black folks moving to Atlanta and so forth. Phoenix becoming a much bigger city and so forth. And as people every 4 years say this will be the year that Texas turns blue, that's also put in the sense of, well, it's becoming, so many Blacks and Asians and Latinx folks and college educated white folks moving to those places. And it's almost seems like when the same question is asked about these now Trump counties, now Trump places in the Midwest, there's no discussion of that dynamic. It's almost it's like the unspoken assumption is that the same white people who lived there in the 2000s live there now, but they changed their mind. But there's no sense of, have those places actually changed? And I wonder if there's just an assumption that, Atlanta's different and Phoenix is different, but what cheer Iowa has exactly the same people. It's just that some of them have died, and as Sean said, now they're angry, right? And so I wonder, for instance, if it's part of this political shift due to the fact that folks who are maybe more liberal minded have moved, because we've definitely become much more of a self-sorting country. So people who live there, maybe because they're part of the LGBTQ community, maybe just because they look around and see so many angry white people and say, I'm white, but I ain't angry like that. And so then they go someplace else. People who finish high school and they leave and go to college and they don't want to come back, or they move to the big city and get a blue collar job or whatever. And so not that people are moving to those places, but the people who are left are the ones that are angry, and the ones who are not angry have left. So I guess there is a demographic shift, but in the sense of people leaving and not coming. I don't, don't really have a conclusion from that, but just sort of thinking about how like these last 4 election cycles apply to these broader issues of memory, of shift, and so forth.
Amy?
Yeah, I wish I had some sort of better organized thoughts. I think I kind of want to jump off of the question that just appeared in the chat, in terms of this kind of lens of spectrality and how it might go hand in hand with issues of loss, as we've just been revisiting, and also with whiteness and white supremacy. I guess I'll say briefly, one of the things that got me thinking about this issue was, I think like so many people that are a part of this conference, I grew up in the Midwest, but studied in the South. And I grew up in Jefferson City, Missouri, where there's lots of regular employment because it's the state capital. So I never really experienced the, flagging employment issue of, so many other Midwestern places, whether that be agriculture or industry. And so I was kind of prepared to confront bitterness when I went to the South to study the Civil War, but less prepared to confront bitterness when I came back to the Midwest, here to Youngstown. So that sort of, again, got me thinking about this issue of loss, like almost like a Midwestern lost cause, that there are these parallels in terms of this sense of bitterness and loss. I guess I'll say to try to also speak to the question in the chat. I think the racial component is extremely important. I was trying to actually thinking about this the other day. There's certainly a parallel in terms of, the lost cause, or this source of white Southern bitterness stems from the destruction of slavery as a system of labor. And a lot of the bitterness that I experience in my community comes from the loss of another system of labor, labor in the steel mills. I think there are parallels, but I don't want to diminish the importance of, racial slavery as not only a system of labor, but as a social, system of social and cultural control. So I'm not really sure, I'm wandering a bit, but yeah, I don't know. As I said, it's just a kind of a new theoretical approach that I have started dabbling with this fall, and just kind of see where it takes me, I guess, at this point.
Say, John, can I add one thing?
Yeah.
What's paradoxical to me is that with this rise of Midwestern white bitterness and anger, we're also seeing in South Dakota, even in small rural communities, an increase in minorities. The number of African American, Latino Americans who are beginning to migrate to these small towns. And it's not unusual now to look at the graduating class from a small town in South Dakota with maybe 18 seniors. And there are African American students, Mexican American students in the class. And I find that interesting. I mean, my small town has several, which is only about 1,300 people, the town I was raised in. We have several African American families, Asian American families, Mexican American families who are business owners, law enforcement officers. So it's kind of like there's a twin trajectories. We're seeing some of this migration that David's been getting at. And I'm not sure the migration I'm talking about is the same as what David has eloquently been talking about. But we're seeing this migration of minorities to small rural communities. At the same time, I'm detecting this real secessionist behavior, this rebellious behavior of white South Dakotans who are just fed up with the cosmopolitan nature of urban America and want to secede from it.
I had just one other thought, if I may, kind of in reference to this issue of loss. One of the things that I was also thinking about as I was preparing for this talk, also in conjunction with the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, I was thinking about the loss and erasure of Black Midwestern communities, which has come up a number of times. In my own community, again, as much as there's this talk of the disappearance of the steel mills and industry, there was also a really thriving Black business community and nearby city of Warren, which is almost totally, it's totally gone now. It was sort of replaced by immigrant communities that came in and bought out the Black businesses as the nature of migration changed over time. So anyway, just another thought about maybe some parallels between these ideas of ghost towns or lost communities. There's certainly an element of that to this this part of the world as well.
Just to quickly add to an earlier point about small towns in the Midwest becoming more ethnically and racially diverse, Thomas Friedman has a really nice little piece about his hometown of Wilmer, Minnesota, which has, it's just what you're talking about, Sean. And I'm, let's see, what is the other town that I was thinking of? but you know, there is this influx into the Midwest. Beardstown, Illinois. There's a really good book about the, you know, the immigration into Beardstown, Illinois, contemporary immigration. And also the fact that Chicago has such a huge Latinx population is quite significant, I think. So, you know, there's vibrance and diversity in the Midwest. And one other point, there have been other periods when there's been anger and bitterness in the rural Midwest, going back to the 1890s and then the 1930s, 20s and 30s. And so maybe it would be smart to compare these periods of time to just kind of weigh just how extreme what we're going through right now is, if we look back to earlier periods of resentment and anger and frustration and feeling left behind. So, you know, there's cycles of this, and you know, so anyway, that's just my two cents worth.
Well, we are getting the hook here from the organ, so we need to close down this discussion. Thanks to all the participants